Hello, and welcome to Diplomatic Community from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
On the need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization, we are facing just exactly the same problem, just exactly the same conflict between two schools of philosophy that they faced in the earliest days of America.
I'm Kelly McFarland, ISD's Director of Programs and Research and your friendly local podcast host. I don't know about you, but I've always been a sucker for year in review and best of the year lists. With that in mind, we asked Foreign Policy's Amy Mackinnon to join us to talk about the year that was in U.S. foreign policy. All of you listening out there know well that it has been a busy year in American foreign policy. From the Ukraine war to China to a new national security strategy, it's been a fast-paced year that has had serious implications for this decade and beyond. Amy walks us through what she found to be the most important stories from 2022, some other issues that may have been lost in the fog of Ukraine, and provides us a glimpse into what she thinks could be coming in 2023. Amy Mackinnon is an award-winning national security and intelligence reporter at Foreign Policy. She has reported from across Eastern Europe and was previously based in Moscow and in Tbilisi, Georgia, as senior editor for the crisis reporting site Coda Story. Mackinnon is a recipient of the Alfred I. duPont-Columbia Award for her reporting on homophobic vigilantes in Russia. She speaks Russian and has a master's degree in journalism from the Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY and a dual master's in Russian, Central, and Eastern European Studies from the University of Glasgow and Corvinus University of Budapest. Let's listen to the conversation. So everybody loves their end of the year lists, whether or not it's the best movies of 2022 or the best music or the best recipes or whatever. And with that in mind, we've brought in Amy Mackinnon from Foreign Policy to talk about a foreign policy year and end of year review. So Amy, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm not sure this year, especially a year in review of foreign policy is going to be as exciting. Well, it's going to be as cheery as, say, a music or movie year in review, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, definitely a lot going on. Whether or not it's all, happy and cheerful is another question. But you alluded to the biggest issue of the year, that's not a good thing, and that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So we're going to start there, and I've got sort of three questions tied into one here.
Okay.
And since the invasion, I want to ask you what was your biggest surprise in early February, late January, when that happened, or even as the war has progressed? What's been the biggest surprise for you in terms of the Ukraine war? What do you think was the biggest surprise for the rest of the DC foreign policy community? And do you think we have more surprises in store moving forward?
So I think the biggest surprise, I have two parts to that answer, at least the two biggest surprises for me. I think the first, perhaps not surprise, but just incredibly kind of notable and remarkable aspect of the build up to the war was the role played by the US in signaling that this was about to happen. Especially now, given everything that we've seen, it is astonishing how prescient they were, but more so how public they were about what they were seeing, what the Russians were planning on doing, and to both warn the Ukrainians, but also to warn allies and partners in Europe, and to begin getting everybody on the same page in terms of what was about to happen, first and foremost, but then also in terms of the response. And I think that has, quite understandably kind of fallen to the wayside a little bit in light of all the horrors that we have seen since February 24th. But it really did mean that, it was incredibly effective. The Ukrainians were skeptical until quite late on in February that this was about to happen, but it did enable them to make some important preparations, that sharing of information and intelligence, and also it laid the groundwork for the sanctions packages that we've seen in response. I mean, they came out with remarkable rapidity in the early days, even, and then first weeks of the war, to kind of provide an immediate response to what Russia was doing. So that is something that is always kind of in the back of my mind, as that, it was an extraordinarily bizarre period to be reporting on Ukraine and reporting on what the administration was worrying about. It was an extraordinarily bizarre period to be in Ukraine. I was there just before the war. So that's kind of one aspect. And then, I mean, the obvious answer, I think, in terms of the biggest surprise is just how badly the Russians have performed. I was very pessimistic that a war was going to happen. I did not expect the Russians. It just seemed like an easy question of numbers. The Russians have X military budget, the Ukrainians have Y. The Russians have, military of this size, weapons of these capabilities and these ranges, and the Ukrainians have, on pretty much every metric, the Ukrainians were just smaller, and on paper, in theory, not as formidable as the Russians, but that, it's obviously shaken out in a very different way. And I think that is, to your second question, I think that's clearly the biggest surprise for the DC foreign policy community. And I think you see in the military aid that has been given by the Biden administration a real evolution in how they see this war going. Because in the run up to the war, they really were just sending javelins, these very light anti-tank, kind of shoulder mounted munitions. And now we're all the way up to HIMARS. Their expectations for what the Ukrainians are capable of doing, but also of where this war might go has clearly evolved profoundly over the months. So there's two ways this war ends. There's either going to be an unconditional surrender by Russia, which I think is highly unlikely. And then the most obvious way this war ends will be with some kind of piece of paper, right? You might not want to call it a peace deal or a settlement, but there will be a document which both sides outline what they agree to do. What that looks like, and particularly the road to getting to that point, is I go over this in my head and with my editor again and again, and it's very, very hard to see what the road to that point will look like. And I think there's two things to take into account. One is that the Ukrainians have been and continue to be incredibly bold in this war, and that can yield some unexpected actions. Like some of their strikes on Crimea, the strike recently very far into Russia. That has yielded some unexpected surprises. And then, the other kind of wild card is the Russians. That they, much as they have been on the back foot in recent months, in light of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Russians are exceptionally good at playing a weak hand well. And whilst their military has a whole host of issues, they really excel at being quite creative and in very dastardly ways with the limited resources and limited capabilities that they do have. And of course, to top it all off, they're very willing to break international norms and laws along the way, as we're now seeing with these strikes on civilian infrastructure. And to top it off, they have a political leader who has continually chosen to ignore what would have been the sensible thing to do from a military standpoint, to kind of continue with this political decision to continue to prosecute the war and to continue the kind of ultimate aim of permanently kneecapping Ukraine's ability to exist as an independent country. And so I think all of that gives you the foundations for potentially a lot of big twists and turns to come. But I'm going to be kind of boring and say that it would be unwise of me to try and say what those surprises would be. So sorry, slightly unsatisfactory answer, but that's, when I look at what is to come in this war, that's kind of where my thinking is at the moment.
Yeah, and it's a totally fair answer though, because as you mentioned, some of the surprises we've already seen, and new and unprecedented actions kind of speaks to the level of who the heck knows what surprise is coming down the pipe next. But I do think you hit it on the head when you talked about the use of intel before the war. I found that to be surprising, really well done. As a diplomatic historian and former intel analyst, it just kind of was like, wow, this is, and just the level of work that it took in the U.S. government to get those things declassified in a rapid way to be able to share them and make them public, I think was a really strong move and surprising because it really hadn't been done. So moving to the next question, Ukraine is, arguably the biggest foreign policy story of the year.
Mhm.
Are there any stories out there that you think rival it for top foreign policy story of 2022?
I don't think there's a rival, given how just kind of shocking and norm shattering Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been. But I think from from a policy perspective, I think the China story is this year, and I think will continue to be the major foreign policy story of the day. I mean, it's clearly top of mind for the Biden administration. It was clear in the national security strategy that whilst they see Russia as a very immediate and very disruptive threat, that China is the challenge that we're going to be dealing with for at least a generation. And I think it's interesting. You're starting to hear, Jake Sullivan recently described, that we're entering an era which is the post Cold War era. Couple of posts to get your head around there. And that was quite striking for me because all I have known is the post Cold War era. I'm a child of the end of the Cold War, and so it's quite a thought to think we are potentially entering, and I agree with him when he says with this, this is the end of the post Cold War era, and it's quite it's very unnerving to think that we're entering into a new era and we don't quite know how that's going to look, but clearly China is going to be a central part of that equation. And the administration has put huge focus on that in their diplomacy, trying to invest in alliances and relationships in East Asia and through formats like the Quad and AUKUS. And we've seen a lot of action, particularly around semiconductors. So we're all having to get very versed in these very complicated technologies. There was the CHIPS Act passed by Congress earlier this year, which includes a mammoth amount of money. I think it's almost $300 billion to invest in kind of manufacturing those kind of things more domestically in the US. And then in October, we had probably one of the biggest foreign policy decisions of the administration this year, I would say, outside of the Ukraine war, but that is not the most kind of sexy decision or kind of sexy foreign policy move, which is the export control. I suppose there are plenty of wonks in this town actually that would call it a very exciting
Yeah,
moment.
come
But
on.
with
That's what they
the
live and breathe. Yeah.
that's what we're here for,
Yeah.
right? The export control banning the export of semiconductors to China, but also software and equipment used in manufacturing of that. I mean, it's deep in the policy weeds, but that was a huge, huge decision to really kind of target China and its goals of prioritizing its cutting edge technologies and to really try and hit them where it hurts.
So you mentioned the national security strategy. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts on it? How does it sort of hold up against what you see as the challenges facing the U.S. and its allies?
I think it was there's nothing terribly surprising in it. I mean, it's come quite late. It came almost 2 years into the Biden administration, but it was a pretty clear articulation of the policy that we have seen from the administration thus far, right? There was a lot of focus on allies and partners, international alliances, a lot of talk of foreign policy for the middle class, of kind of breaking down those silos and kind of getting the message across about how foreign policy impacts things at home. When this has really been a year for seeing that. I mean, you look at the kind of fluctuations we've seen in gas prices, right? That these two realms are not siloed off from each other. One thing that was very notable about it was there was next to no mention of Afghanistan. It was, if you do a control F, there's four. Afghanistan is mentioned four times in the whole of the national security strategy. And given that is, I think without question, the darkest kind of blotch on Biden's foreign policy record to date, it's just quite remarkable that there was just not more mention of it there and of what the future holds for Afghanistan and where the US sees its role in that. There was also some tensions, I think, in the national security strategy, but I don't think that is unique to the Biden administration. That is every national security strategy. My editor reminded me of the phrase recently, a camel is a horse that's been designed by a committee. And I think it's just it's inevitably what happens when you try and wrap in your approach to the whole entire world into under 50 pages. I think one of the things that we pulled out of that when we were writing our piece on this is, the Biden administration's clearly prioritized championing democracy and human rights around the world, but also of taking on these really hard realpolitik challenges, such as China and climate change. And a lot of analysts will point to there's clearly some inherent tensions in how you do both of those things at the same time, and that comes forward most clearly, I think, in the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? Long seen as a key strategic partner in the region, but deeply, deeply problematic human rights record, and was extremely unhelpful to the Biden administration this year with the OPEC Plus decision, which was, seen as keeping oil prices high.
So you've mentioned Russia and China, and we've talked about the national security strategy. Russia, China, obviously dominating the headlines in foreign policy, but in a year like last year, when there are these sort of tectonic shifts, and you have a arguably great power conflict again with a conventional war in Ukraine. What are some stories, or what is sort of the story that you see as being unrecognized or under-recognized throughout the year?
I think it's more under-recognized than unrecognized. Clearly, it's not unrecognized, but I think it's Afghanistan. I think as the tempo of the Ukraine story began to pick up pace late last year and then into early this year, it just seemed to kind of directly rival the Afghanistan story for headlines. And I was at the White House Correspondents Association dinner earlier this year, and there was this was after the Ukraine war had begun, obviously. There was a very moving tribute to the journalists that had been killed, reporting on the conflict in Ukraine thus far. And after the dinner, I spoke to an Afghan activist who was there, and she said, there was no mention of Afghanistan. What about the journalists in Afghanistan? And it was very, was a very stark kind of reminder of how the conversation has shifted so quickly from everybody being so laser focused on Afghanistan and what's happening there to everybody suddenly being so laser focused on Ukraine. And the statistics from Afghanistan on things like food insecurity are just mind-blowing. Like, the World Food Programme estimates that something like 90% of households don't have enough food to eat. That's the highest number in the world right now. And much as the airlift that we saw in the last 2 weeks of the U.S. presence there was incredible and did manage to get something like 120,000 people out in just 2 weeks, there's still tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Afghans who worked for the U.S. and its partners over the years, who might be at risk of retaliation from the Taliban, and who might be entitled to visas or refugee status in the U.S. or Europe or elsewhere, who are stuck there. And there's just incredible backlogs in processing visas in the U.S. and elsewhere. Just a very sad story, and a lot of questions about yes, the U.S. wanted to kind of wind down its military presence there, and there's compelling arguments for that. But what does the U.S. owe Afghanistan still? And I think that's a question that we haven't really answered. And given that it was mentioned 4 times in the national security strategy, I don't think we will get much of an answer from the Biden administration. I mean, there's I shouldn't say the U.S. is doing nothing. There's significant amounts of humanitarian aid being sent over there whilst trying to kind of bypass the Taliban, which is incredibly complicated and I think probably not working terribly well. As we look ahead to the next year, I think we may see Afghanistan return to the headlines. It's one of the things that House Republicans have said that they really want to focus on in the slate of investigations that they have planned now that they have regained control of the House. And so I think you are going to see efforts by House Republicans to try and dig into what happened in those last days of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, how the withdrawal ended the way it did, and the evacuation plans. And so I'm interested that we haven't had a thorough accounting yet of why things ended the way they did. I mean, immediately in the aftermath, as it was going on, the Biden administration said they were going to do a so-called hot wash of the problems, and that was not something that was ever really made public. And so this may be the first kind of deep dive we get as to how it ended the way it did.
Yeah, and you mentioned Afghanistan and that, and as something that might crop back up over the next year, especially as the House Republicans take control. And I completely agree with you on that. I think it will be something that they push forward on. But speaking to that aspect of things to look forward to in the coming year, what are some other stories that you're kind of watching potentially that might creep up in 2023?
So my colleagues and I are working on a story about this right now. So stay tuned to Foreign Policy.
No spoiler alert. Come on.
we haven't
Yeah.
started yet, but our editor has been nagging us about it. So we have our deadline set for next week. I think clearly the war in Ukraine. What has been astonishing about the war in Ukraine is it's been the appetite for news on it. We see incredible appetite and interest from audiences, and I think that definitely applies across the board to other news organizations as well. And so we're going to see this story, continuing well into 2023, but also all of the dimensions of it, right? There's the war itself. There's the question of Western support. How much, is the US and its allies giving? Will that hang together throughout the winter? Energy prices, will the price cap that was announced this week on Russian energy, how is that going to go? That, all seems incredibly complicated, and Russia said it's not going to work with countries that have a price cap. There's the global food supply issues, will the Black Sea Grain Initiative hold? So a lot of dimensions just to the Ukraine story itself to keep tabs on. And then also there's a question of what happens within Russia. There's, are they going to announce another mobilization after? They may need to, but the last one was just so catastrophic and drove so many young Russian men out of the country. There's the question of American citizens imprisoned there, Paul Whelan, Brittany Griner, also the continued imprisonment of Navalny. What happens for the regime? What happens to Putin? I mean, he has a pretty consolidated grip on power and has worked hard to achieve that over his 2 decades in office. But this war, I think, it has certainly opened Pandora's box for Russia, and I think I have heard people say that it's this is the beginning of the end for Putin. That could be a very long road, but I think certainly it pays to kind of pay attention to how the war is impacting Russia domestically. China is clearly going to be big top story for 2023. Again, many dimensions there: the COVID lockdowns, the recent protests, crackdown on the Uyghurs, tech decoupling, but also the Russia-China relationship. What does that look like? How does the war in Ukraine impact that? I mentioned Saudi Arabia earlier. I mean, the Biden administration has said, in light of the OPEC Plus decision, that they're going to reevaluate U.S.-Saudi ties. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a rinse and repeat in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, but it's going to be interesting to see what the conclusion of that reevaluation process is. Afghanistan may reemerge into the headlines depending on how this House Republican investigation goes. And I think, looking to Africa, the conflict in Ethiopia, Tigray, will this, truce that they agreed in early November of this year, is that going to hold? Is that going to bring an end to this horrific 2 years of fighting that we've seen there? And then something else I'm keeping an eye on is the Sahel, where there's just been a wave of coups over the past couple of years, and destabilizing the countries themselves, but also in some instances kind of paving the way for Russia to move in through the Wagner mercenary group. And we've seen that most acutely in Mali, where Russia has really taken advantage of the French decision to restructure the posture of its counterterrorism force there and send in the Wagner group. And with a very light force, with only a couple of thousand guys, they have been able to pretty much lock down their presence in the country with a very light footprint. So and to terrible cost to human rights and to the civilian population there. I mean, they do not bring security, they do not bring stability. So that's something else that we'll be keeping an eye on as well.
I do think one other thing to add, if I may, on that
Of
list too,
course.
is just is Yemen as well. I think
Yeah.
Yemen, since the ceasefire has kind of dropped out of the news somewhat, but there's still a long way to go to solidify some sort of peaceful conclusion to that war as well. And it's something that we've seen in the past can very quickly spark back up again. So I think that'll be something to watch in 2023 as well. All right, going to get you out of here on this last question. And I mentioned at the top that I always love these sort of end of the year things because I like my, top things to read lists. But are there any good, books, articles, anything that you sort of had your eye on throughout the year that you would recommend to our listeners?
So what's on my holiday reading list for the holidays this year is going to be Chris Miller's Chip War. I haven't yet read it, but
Yeah, I
it
just got that
is.
too.
Yeah, I've heard excellent things. That this is the definitive deep dive on semiconductors, and I think it just won the FT's Book of the Year prize or something like that. And so
Talk about policy wonk deep dives.
I
And
know,
yeah,
yeah. Merry Christmas to me. So that's on my reading list. But I think it's going to be a very good primer for a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about, both next year, but in the years to come as well.
All right. Sounds great. Amy Mackinnon, thank you for getting us up to speed on 2022 and giving us some things to think about in the next year. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Our thanks again to Amy Mackinnon for giving us a rundown of key foreign policy issues of 2022 and giving us a few things to ponder for the next year. Be sure to keep listening to Diplomatic Immunity in the new year as we continue our Season 5 dive into the world of multilateralism. Until we meet again. This episode was produced by Daniel Henderson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation in New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work.